July 1944. A German prisoner in Kansas touches a fence with one hand and a paycheck with the other. He expected boots and batons. He got lemonade, a library card, and wages recorded in pencil. Why did America pay the enemy to bring in the wheat? And why did that policy crack a wall propaganda had built for years? Tonight, fences that held the body, rules that changed the mind. Let's explore the following story. The July sun over central Kansas didn't just shine. It pressed down, a weight you could feel in your lungs. Wheat heads bowed in waves, gold as far as any road ran. A U.S. Army escort truck idled at the field's edge, heat shimmering above its hood. And in the rows, a young German prisoner of war wiped grit from his eyes and studied a small rectangle of paper with a stamped total, $0.80 credited, farm detail. Not cash, not punishment. Canteen credit recorded by the army under the rules he'd been warned would never apply to him. He had a name, and he hadn't used it much lately. Hans Mueller, 23, captured in North Africa, processed in Algeria, moved by ship across the Atlantic, then by rail into a heartland he had been told was brutal, chaotic, godless. What he'd been told wasn't matching what he was living. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The field boss, Earl Johnson, a farmer in sweat-darkened overalls, didn't ask about ideology. He pointed at a broken fence rail and then at a coil of wire, and Hans went to work with a fellow prisoner under the eyes of two guards. The rules were visible everywhere. Fence lines at the camp, a curfew bell, an escort, and no wandering off. But the routine was different than he expected. Clean clothes on intake, a medical check, 3 meals that came on time, and a ledger that ticked credit into a camp canteen where you could choose a pack of cigarettes. A pencil, a postcard home. At noon, the farmer's wife brought out a glass pitcher. Beads of condensation ran like mercury down the sides. Lemon slices knocked against the rim. She set the tray on a crate for the prisoners and the guards both, nodded once, and returned to the house without a word. Hans waited. When he saw the corporal drink first, he poured himself half a cup. The lemonade was sweet and sharp. The taste startled him more than the kindness. He had prepared himself for humiliation, for kicks and clubs, for cages. What he found instead was a system, procedures spoken in plain English, forms filled, names logged, rules kept. The camp in Kansas had towers and wire, yes. It also had a library card stamped with his prisoner number and a shelf where a battered English grammar sat beside a book of American short stories. Under the Geneva Convention, words he'd never expected to matter, non-military labor was allowed and paid. Farmers paid the army by contract. The army awarded credit. The canteen had price lists. On this first day out on a farm near Salina, the work was simple. Mend, carry, cut, stack. The men on the other side of the rows included teenagers, older neighbors, and a grandmother who wore her hair tucked behind a scarf and moved as if the heat were a thing to be negotiated, not endured. There were no speeches about forgiveness here, no moral declarations. The harvest didn't make room for that. The harvest demanded hands. He didn't shake anyone's hand and nobody offered. An escort watched every movement. When he lifted a tangled strand of wire, the guard glanced over and said, "Watch your fingers." It sounded like a rule and a courtesy at once. The sound of Kansas is not the same as the sound of war. Here there was wind that hummed through wheat like a bow across a string. A grasshopper skittered.
Somewhere a tractor coughed.
Then it didn't. A belt had slipped or a carburetor had gummed, and Hans found himself staring, noticing the way the farmer jiggled the choke. His own father had repaired bicycles with hands that looked like that, knuckles mapped in old scars. Patience learned the slow way. The farmer's daughter tried not to stare at the prisoners as she carried a crate of bottled Coca-Cola in from a truck. When Hans took a sip, the fizz caught his throat and he coughed, eyes watering. The girl turned away to hide a smile and failed. It wasn't mockery. It was the face you make when you see someone meet a new taste for the first time. under a white sun and across a square mile of grain. A fact announced itself to Hans in a way propaganda never could. Rules traveled better than rumors. What he was encountering wasn't softness, it was order. The order of contracts and sign-out chits, of a guard's whistle starting the day and a bugle and a bell ending it. The order of an escort truck that always idled in the same place. The order of a ledger that would show his 80-cent credit before supper. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was not the nightmare he'd braced for while the troopship pitched under Atlantic stars. That difference, small as a stamped chit, clear as a glass of lemonade, was enough to open a question he hadn't permitted himself since the uniform had become his daily skin. If the world could look like this, and not like the posters, then what else might be wrong? When the escort barked, "Load up!" the prisoners climbed into the truck and sat on the plank benches, sweat drying to salt. Across the road, the Johnson's barley stood uncut. Across an ocean, a city named Hamburg was bracing for the next siren. Hans rested the back of his head against the truck's sideboard and closed his eyes. He could still taste sugar and lemon. He could still feel the rough edge of a pay chit between his fingers. And he wondered, not for the first time that day, what kind of country does this on purpose in the middle of a war? They had instructed him since boyhood. America was a carnival of vice. Films and posters came with confident captions. Decadent, divided, dangerous, a place where prisoners were beaten until they provided amusement or information, whichever came first. The curriculum was simple, because simple was easy to remember. America was chaos. Germany was order, and order wins. In May 1943, the desert undid a portion of that certainty. The fighting had been dust and glare, not the clean illustrations of a schoolroom map. When Hans's squad was overrun near a wadi cut with scrub, he expected the first rifle butt before the first canteen. Instead, a corporal with a sunburned neck crouched and tipped water toward his cracked lips. No speech, no smile. Just the practical act that life requires. Hans waited for a kick to follow, and it didn't. He was photographed, logged, tagged by number, and moved with other prisoners to a holding camp in Algeria where the sun examined everyone equally. On the ship west, men squinted into a wind that salted skin to stiffness. They slept in tiers and swung their feet over hammocks when the sea said so. The rumor line ran both ways. Some swore they were going to England, others said Siberia. Then somebody heard a purser's radio, and the word New Orleans floated through the hold like a stubborn gull. Hans didn't believe it. Why move prisoners so far from the front? Why spend fuel to relocate the enemy to the other side of the world? The answer wasn't a whisper. It came in paper, in forms that insisted on their own reality. On the dock, Americans with clipboards asked no questions beyond the necessary ones. He was processed and loaded into a railcar with high windows. When the train turned into land that widened and flattened, the sky did a thing it rarely did in Europe. It took over. He could not stop looking up. He met, now and then, men from other camps who had come back the same way. By sponsor, by patience, by oath. Some kept bakeries, some cut hair, some coached baseball without knowing the rules as children. None of them told long stories. They said enough, that the rules had held, that the canteen had sold pencils, that the library stamp had thunked like a heart. They said they had learned a strange math in America, that fences keep people in and rules keep people human, that if you keep a rule on purpose, you are different from the man who keeps it because he is afraid. If you drive to Concordia today, you can find what's left of the foundations, a line of concrete that means a bunkhouse once stood, fence posts returning to the same earth they once divided from itself. In a small museum nearby, the glass reflects the present over the past. There are sketches a prisoner made of a guard's profile. Letters in unsure English, telling a farmer's wife that the gloves fit. Price lists from a canteen that sold paper and soap and cigarettes to men who had learned again how to choose. If you stand there long enough, the lights will brighten and dim by schedule. On one wall hangs a photograph, a young man in denim overalls, hair collapsed from sweat, standing beside a farmer in a brimmed hat. The caption does not say which is which. It does not need to. The picture is less about identification than about a posture two people discovered they could live in for a moment. Not agreement, not absolution, but work. You can understand this as a small story, and you would not be wrong. But you can also see it as a large one told small. In a century busy with flags and speeches, a country decided in countless offices and fields to keep rules when it would have been easier, more immediately satisfying, to break them. That decision wrote itself into ledgers and chits and lunch trays and library cards and the taste of lemonade on a day that would have broken a weaker idea. A prisoner learned to say please and thank you in a language he didn't grow up with. A guard learned to let a man fix a belt without announcing it to the yard. A farmer learned how to nod in a way that made a place shaped like an invitation without using the word. The war ended in Europe with a capitulation that made headlines and photographs. It ended in one Kansas field with a tractor that started after a belt set right. You can argue scale, you cannot argue that both mattered to the people there. Hans carried forward the quiet victory he had not known to look for, that a person obliged to be an enemy can, under rules kept on purpose, become something else. When he died, his son, a teacher, hung a small frame in his classroom. In it, the old man stands in a field, not in uniform, the wheat at his waist, the shadow of a fence post falling like a sundial on the ground. The teacher tells his students once a year what the picture does not explain. My father came here a prisoner. He died a citizen. Then he poses two questions that are the story's proper inheritance. If you had been the farmer, would you have offered water? If you had been the prisoner, would you have trusted the smile behind the wire? The questions hang in the room like the sound of a bell after it stops ringing. That is where the story belongs, in the ordinary air of a place that still keeps rules, on purpose, in the hope that the people on the other side of the next argument will keep theirs. 2. Morning came with the dry click of a switch that brought the yard lights down and the sky up. By now, Hans knew the order of sounds. The bugle from the far corner, the mess hall trays, the pencil tapping the workboard as names were called. When Mueller landed on farm detail, he felt something he didn't announce to his face: relief. The field had rules that were easier to keep than the ones inside men's heads. They rolled past grain elevators and weathered barns, the truck boards creaking like an old house settling. At the Johnson place, Seepilid James Doherty stood aside with his clipboard, a pencil tucked behind his ear like a second thought. He had a mechanic's hands, scarred in all the ordinary places, nails trimmed with a pocket knife, grease that no soap could quite talk out of the lines. He talked in verbs: sign, carry, mend, check. He did not ask questions designed to trap answers. He asked, "You know carburetors?" and waited without staring. The tractor made its case for attention the way old machines do. First a cough, then a sullen refusal, then the hurt silence that says, "It's in there." "Keep looking." Doherty looked. Hans looked. The farmer looked. The air smelled of heat, fuel, and cut straw. Hans pointed at the fuel bowl, then at the intake, then made a small circle with his finger. "Turn it over." The engine wheezed. He took a moment that felt like a negotiation with a stubborn animal, loosened a single screw, reseated a gasket with the gentleness of a man aligning two ideas, and nodded again. The engine caught and stayed. No one clapped. The farmer slapped the fender once. Doherty drew a quick checkmark on the clipboard and said, "Good," as if he were letting the word out on parole. What passed between men then was not friendship. It was a professional courtesy that uses fewer words than any other language. The guard signed a tool chit that let Hans borrow a wrench set under his number. Hans signed it back at the end of the day with everything accounted for. The next morning, Doherty didn't say hello. He slid a harmonica from his breast pocket on break and played a bar of something that sounded like late summer. Hans answered without thinking, humming a German folk line his mother had used to hush the kitchen when the clock was wrong. The guard did not ask the tune's name. The answer in that place would have been too much. Respect in the field moved in increments, a nod that lacked suspicion, a gate left unlatched because the man behind you would do the right thing. A bucket set down where anyone could reach it first. Inside the wire at night it was harder. Some men wore their belief like a uniform under the uniform. But out here the harvest set the rhythm and competence set the key. A man could be an enemy in the morning and still be the man who set the belt right after lunch. Doherty's rules were clear because he kept them exactly himself. Stay in sight. No talking to civilians. Tools back by 1600. He didn't perform the rules like a show. He maintained them like a vehicle. Fluids topped, belts tensioned, nothing rattling loose. Hans found comfort in that. He had known men who loved rules because rules let them hurt others righteously. Doherty loved rules because work requires predictability. The Johnsons matched that tone. Earl Johnson's gratitude never got sloppy. He didn't slip a sandwich into a prisoner's hand or make speeches about how we're all the same under the sun. He showed thanks by assigning the hardest work first, which in his world was respect. Mrs. Johnson marked that respect differently when she saw blisters rise on Hans's palms the second week. She appeared the next day with a pair of gloves that had seen only a winter's worth of use. "These'll do," she said to the air, not to him, and placed them on the crate where the water sat. He put them on. They fit. The farmer watched and didn't speak. Through August, the pattern took a shape strong enough to lean on. Work, water, break. He found himself working beside an American boy with ears too big for the rest of his head and a face caught between 15 and 20. The boy kept his eyes down and passed tools like a baseball shortstop makes the double play feed. Quick, mostly blind, sure. They didn't speak. Speaking wasn't in the rulebook. Hans caught himself at one point wanting to say danke, and he swallowed the word. He nodded instead. The boy nodded back. Critics later would say things about coddling the enemy. Men in bars would cut through the policy with the easy edge of a story told third hand. But out in the rows, with the head of a hammer fitting a staple into wood, men who did not have the luxury of opinion noticed that the field did not move if hands did not move it. And so those hands moved. He looked up only when the wind changed and a cloud lay a cool hand over the valley. Out past the elevator and the water tower, everything worn by work reflected back a kind of polish that wasn't pride so much as stamina. He could imagine the rest of a life, if a life could be found in the ashes of a city that had once been home. It was a dangerous thought. He let it pass and returned to the fence. That afternoon, a belt on the Johnson tractor jumped the pulley, and the farmer made a sound older than English. Hans stepped forward, then stopped, then stepped again, when the guard lifted 2 fingers in a permission small as a breath. He looked, pointed, and opened both hands. "May I?" The farmer tilted his head, which in these parts is consent. Hans reseated the belt with a bar and a grunt, then called for the choke. The engine coughed, caught, and smoothed into a patient thrum. The farmer didn't smile. He tapped the fender with the side of his hand, a salute you give a machine, not a man, and said, "Try it." The field moved again. That was thanks enough. Not for the last time. Hans suspected the truth was simple enough to miss. The United States was fighting a war with fences and with rules. The fences were expected. The rules were the surprise. And the rules did as much work as any rifle. He would have found that sentence laughable the year before. In a Kansas field, the sentence fit the scene. At day's end, on the truck, sweat cooling and chaff tickling his neck, Hans ran his thumb over a splinter in the bench and thought of the ledger where a clerk would add, in pencil, 2 digits to a day that would become a week. Somewhere beyond the wire, people argued about whether this made sense. In the field, everything had made sense for 7 hours straight. Camp Concordia announced itself by fences first, clean lines, patrols at the corners, a geometry that told your body where it stopped. After that, the noises of any organized place, a bell that meant roll call, boots that meant transition, voices that meant there was a schedule large enough to carry all of it. He had heard that America was loud. This America was punctual. Intake produced the ritual he now recognized as the national religion: paperwork. He surrendered what he had. He was assigned what he needed. A clerk wrote his name and his number in a hand that would have earned praise from the instructor at Hans's school in Hamburg. Clean clothing arrived, coarse but new, and a medical check that did not linger or gloat but worked through its list. He walked out of that room feeling less like a captured thing and more like a man installed into a system. The mess hall produced heat and smell and, astonishingly, predictability. The line moved. The trays clattered. Eggs, oatmeal, white bread, jam. He watched a guard put his tray down, bow his head for a second, and then eat. The gesture stirred something in him. He let pass unexamined. He was in no position to inventory other men's reasons. After breakfast, a rumor that felt like a trick at first, and then didn't. A library. He walked in with 2 other prisoners and found not just shelves, but an orderly desk with a librarian who seemed to have mastered the art of seeing both everything and nothing. "You can check out 2 at a time," she said, and held out a card where someone had typed Mueller, Hans, P.W. He chose an English grammar and, without knowing why, a collection of American short stories with a cover that showed a White House and a willow tree. The librarian stamped the due date with a thunk that sounded like a promise kept. Elsewhere, there were English classes taught by a tall man with a farmer's neck and a teacher's patience. He did not smile to put men at ease. He smiled when somebody got the article right. An orchestra rehearsed in the evenings. Hans stopped in the doorway once and watched men put a scrap of the old world together with borrowed instruments, the melody testing the air like a bird looking for its branch. And there was, to his surprise, a POW-run newspaper with puzzles and small editorials that stayed clear of forbidden praise and still somehow managed a cartoon or 2 that made a point. The censors did their work. The paper did its work. None of this erased the wire. None of it erased the watches or the rules, exactly as posted, or the quickness with which a guard could appear when 2 men raised their voices. It did something else. It told the truth completely. The truth was that this place held men securely and treated them predictably, which is a kind of respect that does not depend on affection. He had known a version of order that punished unpredictably and called that power. This was a different version. At dusk, the yard filled with games that made sense to bodies, soccer that found goals between trash cans, ping-pong played on a table with a ding at one corner, chess with a bishop repaired by a glue line. Down one row, 2 guards threw a baseball back and forth with a rhythm that had to have been practiced since they were boys. One of them showed a prisoner how to hold a 4-seam grip. The prisoner nodded and imitated. A guard does not have to do that, Hans thought. And then he filed the thought under the new heading he had built this week. Things I did not expect that are nonetheless happening. He took his books to his bunk and began the business of practicing a language that can make truce with 1,000 mistakes before it refuses you. "Good evening," he said softly. "Good evening." The man on the lower bunk cleared his throat without malice. "Keep it down," he said in German, and Hans kept it down. He learned please and thank you and I don't understand, and he deployed them like tools. At the canteen, he learned the price of a pencil, a paper tablet, a pack of cigarettes. He bought a pencil and a sheet of stationery and began a letter to his sister. He wrote, "Tell Mama I have enough to eat," and then he crossed the line out and wrote it again, the way he suspected a censor would allow. He put the letter away for morning. He had learned that night-tempting fate was a game you played only if you wanted to lose. It would be foolish to say the camp felt like a refuge. A refuge is a thing you choose. He had not chosen this. And yet safety is not an opinion. It is a condition in which a man can sleep without one ear cocked for boots. On the 3rd night at Concordia, he slept. When he woke before dawn, the yard lights threw rectangles through the window, and the wind did its quiet work. In that blue, a thought arrived with the same authority as a stamp. If rules can hold in a war, they might be the point. He knew other men did not agree. Men in the barracks wore their collars stiff with something harder than pride. They spoke of the day the war's tide would turn back and the reckoning that would follow. Hans listened. He said little. He practiced his English, mended what was in front of him, and kept his ledger lines straight. The work detail board would post after breakfast. The wheat would be waiting. So would the wire. Both could be true. That was the education he had started without realizing he had enrolled. It is easy to talk about work until the first hour of real work arrives. That morning, the heat came up early and stayed. The escort truck found its spot by habit. The guard leaned against the fender, the way you lean when you intend to be there as long as needed. "Same rules," he said. "Stay with your detail. Signal if you need water." The rules had been repeated so thoroughly that the repetition itself began to feel like a kind of care. Hans and 9 others crossed into rows that looked orderly from the road and chaotic from within. Dust rose to meet their sweat. The tools had their say. The sickle bit and dragged. The binder clicked and balked. A length of wire sang when a staple drove home. The farmer worked 100 yards ahead, attention moving in circles that made sense only to a man who'd learned every corner of his ground the slow way. No one told stories. Stories require a margin. Work like this filled the margins. When the guard unscrewed the cap from a GI canteen and lifted it in question, Hans nodded. They took turns. The water tasted faintly of metal and mercy. Late morning brought a small disaster. A gate hinge surrendered the shape it had promised to keep. The farmer made that old sound again and looked to the escort for permission. The guard waved Hans forward with a motion as neutral as a stamp. He knelt, felt the wood, and said without thinking, "You need the longer screws." The guard raised an eyebrow. The farmer gave a look that said, "We'll see." Hans cut a shim from a scrap, set the hang, and drove a longer screw through clean grain. The gate moved true. The farmer breathed out through his nose, which here was the same as thank you. The sun did its worst, and then a small kind of best. At noon, the farmer's wife placed a tray on a crate. Lemonade in sweating glasses, a cloth over a plate of bread. She didn't cross the invisible line that had been negotiated in looks and posture. She didn't have to. The gesture stood on its own legs. Hans looked to the guard. The guard took a glass and drank, then nodded. Hans took one too. The lemonade asked nothing and gave back enough to keep a man on his feet. When he set the empty glass down, condensation left a ring like a signature on the crate. Around 2, the farmer's daughter returned, carrying a crate that clinked. Bottled Coca-Cola, necks poking up from a bath of ice. The men glanced at the guard as one creature. He nodded. Hans took a bottle and lifted it, studied the glass, put it to his lips, and met the shock of cold and fizz. He coughed. A prisoner to his right laughed once, the sound of surprise, not mockery. The girl pressed her lips together to keep her own smile from showing and failed. The wind helped dry everyone's face a little. Something had shifted, but it did not announce itself. In place of slogans came competence. A man mended a fence right. Another carried the heavy end without being asked. Someone cleared a jam in the binder with the stubborn gentleness that machines demand. A nod passed between men who were not neighbors and would never be, and yet for those hours they were companions of the same task. You can't write a policy for that. You can only stay out of its way. At day's end, the farmer counted the stacks with the protective tenderness of a man counting what would keep his family fed and his notes paid. He did his own arithmetic. The army would do theirs. The ledger would do the rest. A prisoner named Ernst, a former mechanic with a scar like a river through one eyebrow, held up his palms. They were blisters and dirt and work. He grinned, like a man who'd remembered his body could do a thing other than march and be marched. On the ride back, Hans kept his eyes on the road, as if he could memorize the distances between cottonwoods. He thought of something the English instructor had said, "Show, don't tell," and he laughed once, quietly. The day had shown him more than any order barked in a parade ground ever had. It had shown him how respect can happen without speeches, in the simple practice of doing a job right and not making it harder for the next man. At supper, he passed on the cigarettes and bought a pencil. He sat under the weak light of a barracks bulb and drew the shape of a fence post, with the ring of lemonade still wet on a crate in front of it. He got the line wrong twice and then right, and felt the relief that comes when a shape and your hand come to an agreement. On the bottom, he wrote a word he had learned that day, ledger. He underlined it once, not twice. He didn't know why once was enough, only that it was. When lights out came, he lay awake long enough to listen to the yard quiet down. A harmonica called 2 soft notes from somewhere near the motor pool and was answered by a third. There was a language he did not speak that was still, somehow, speaking to him. It had rules. It had pauses at the right places. It sounded like the end of a long day that had left exactly the right kind of tired. Years pass the way fields do. They change, and then you recognize them anyway. In winter 1946, Hans went home by rule, because the rule said prisoners were to be repatriated in phases. Home was Hamburg, a city he knew by absence. A block where a bakery had stood now offered only the memory of sugar. Tram rails lifted from cobbles like ribs. He lived with 6 relatives in 3 rooms that weren't rooms so much as corners, marked off by sheets. He worked at whatever the day offered, unloading crates at a dock that smelled of wet wood and diesel, fixing a neighbor's bicycle for a slice of bread, rubbing soot from stone with a brush that made a sound he would later hear again when the wind crossed Kansas wheat at certain angles. He did not tell many people about Kansas. When he did, he kept it short. He said there had been fences and rules and work. He said the bread came on time. He said someone had once handed him a glass of lemonade and that it had been hotter than any summer he could remember and colder than any drink he had tasted. If he felt the urge to explain that the drink had taught him as much as the rule book, he swallowed it. Life required other explanations. Ration cards, where to find coal, where not to step. Then a letter arrived that made a life possible again. It came from Kansas, from a family named Johnson, who had been careful with their kindness and, in the care of it, had taught Hans something about the difference between pity and respect. The letter said that if he could manage the paperwork, if he could pass the screenings that looked at a man long and hard, if he could wait through quotas and delays that ran like seasons, then there might be a place for him on the farm for a while. The phrase "for a while" did not disguise its hope. He saved. He waited. He was told no twice, and not yet once. In 1951, the seas that had carried him in chains carried him back by choice. He stepped onto an American dock as a man with a visa sponsored by a farmer, a man who had not changed his name because a name is a ledger entry you carry in your bones. He returned to Kansas and worked again under a sun that had not changed. Work will accept you if you do not lie to it. Later came the night classes and the gentle humiliations of a new driver's test and the expensive pride of a used truck that started every time a winter morning allowed. In 1956, under a roof that did not leak, he raised his right hand and spoke a sentence that had been waiting to be spoken. There were no trumpets. There was the sound of paper sliding back across a counter, the ordinary music of a life being recorded. He shook no hands afterward. He walked outside and looked up at a sky that in this part of the world sits low as a roof and wide as an idea. He opened a repair shop in Kansas City, a place that needed what he knew, how to set a hinge, reseat a belt, listen to a machine until it told you what it needed. He married a librarian who understood that the kindest sentence in any language might be, "You can keep it an extra day." They had 2 children who learned to read receipts and clouds. When the wheat turned gold each year, he drove west and stood by a fence line and breathed the old bugle and wind combination that meant somebody somewhere was putting a day's work to bed. His first full day in Kansas included 2 facts he would end up returning to in memory for years. 1, the guards offered water first and kept their own cups in the same bucket. 2, the procedures unfolded as though they were trying to prove a point. He recognized the strength of institutions, the way a man recognizes the strength of a wall, by tapping it. These weren't the improvisations of sentiment. They were policies that had been taught to men who could repeat them. When someone told him, under the Geneva Convention you can be assigned non-military work, Hans felt something he didn't dare name, a shock of relief that it was written down. Propaganda couldn't account for the way a day actually felt in your body. It had never described powdered eggs and white bread that arrived at the same hour every morning, or the way the library desk stamped return dates without looking up at the person in front of it. It had never suggested that the same government that built barbed wire would also maintain a canteen with price lists and a sign that said, "Leave exact scrip if possible." It had never allowed for a guard who lowered his voice instead of raising it. This is not to say the first impressions were gentle. He saw towers. He heard the clatter of rifle bolts at shift change. He learned quickly that there were places you didn't step and hours you didn't test. But the tone was different than the theater had promised. It was not a display of humiliation. It was a display of procedure, and procedure had a moral of its own. We keep rules on purpose. We keep them when it is easy, and more telling, we keep them when it is tempting not to. A day later, the platoon sergeant called names against a ledger and handed out small cards with the week's work assignments. A brief talk followed, more bulletin than lecture. Non-military labor only. You'll be credited about 80 cents a day, recorded by the army. You spend it in the canteen. There will be no direct cash. Farmers pay the army. That's between them and the quartermaster. He said it as though men in rooms had decided this long before any of them were born. Hans watched an older prisoner, a man with the posture of a career soldier, try to catch the sergeant's eye with a smirk that said, "Your kindness is weakness." The sergeant didn't notice or pretended not to. The announcements ended with a refrain Hans would hear in different wording many times. "Follow the rules and you'll have a steady routine. Break them and you'll lose privileges." It sounded like a compact, thin but strong. That evening in the mess hall, the bread basket arrived with white slices so soft they compressed under a thumb. In his childhood, that kind of bread sat on officers' tables and in windows of bakeries on holidays. Here it came as standard issue with a spoonful of jam. He waited again. Somewhere a trap had to be sprung. The trap didn't come. At the far table, someone laughed at a joke Hans didn't catch. At another, a young guard with a bad haircut set a pocket paperback face down next to his tray. The cover showed a man in a fedora walking through rain. The sight produced an ache Hans couldn't label. There was a world in which a guard read quietly on break while prisoners ate quietly nearby. The world existed. He was sitting in it. Propaganda survived best at distance. When proximity complicated it, you could feel the idea try to hold and then bend. Hans had been good at holding ideas steady, but the canteen ledger did a thing to him that sermons had not. He could choose a pencil or a cigarette, and a clerk would make the mark, and the pencil would be his. Choose is a verb that rearranges a mind when the mind has lived on orders. The first night in the barracks, Hans lay awake and miscounted the rafters twice. Someone down the row was practicing English under his breath. "Good evening, good evening." A man in the top bunk told him to hush. A man on the floor laughed once. The guard outside cleared his throat. At last, the wind did what it does and climbed the corner of the building and pressed a hand against the wall. Hans closed his eyes on a thought that did not permit exclamation points. Maybe I was wrong about some things. The thought didn't come with repentance. It came with weather, routine, and a ledger line that would show up again in the morning. The country had thrown almost everything it had into a war spread, like a map you can't fold back up. In the summer of 1944, the most invisible shortage was hands. Hands to make rivets, hands to put on roofs, hands to bring in wheat that turned from promise to loss if you mistimed a week. Across Kansas, the harvest clock ticked faster than the farmyards could move. The army had men who could stand guard. The army also had, by then, hundreds of thousands of enemy prisoners who, by international agreement, could be assigned non-military work. In offices far from wheat, a decision-acquired ink wrote labor to places that needed. Pay prisoners a set daily credit they can spend in camp. Keep escorts. Keep the rules. Farmers would contract with the government. Quotas would be met if possible. It wasn't a romance. It was a calculation that used numbers to support fields that did not care about politics. The first morning a work detail rolled out to Johnson's place, the truck drums beat over Washboard Road. The guards were young men who would in other years have been linemen or shop hands. One of them chewed a toothpick and said almost nothing. He did not need to. The farmer's eyes did the talking that mattered, useful or not. The answer would be decided before lunch. Hans learned the rhythm quickly, a whistle, a shoulder to the gate, the bite of a fence staple under a hammer face, then the prick of a barb when you weren't paying attention. At his back the sun climbed. At his front, the problem solved itself one rail at a time, until a section of fence stood straight again, and the field's perimeter felt like a sentence that ended with a period. Not an ellipsis. By mid-morning the men moved into wheat that came up to a man's hip. Quality depended on cut and timing. A helper's job was simple honor. Keep pace, keep quiet, keep doing. The escort truck idled within sight, nothing dramatic. No one allowed the fiction they were neighbors. They were not. They were people who needed each other because a war's arithmetic said so. He had expected taunts. He got instead a deference born of practicality. A farmer does not insult the wrench that loosens a rusted bolt. He oils it and puts it back in the box. With every passing hour, the judgment shifted from enemy to competent and back again without ever settling. That suited everyone. Competent men can be watched more efficiently than incompetent ones. By noon, lemonade. By 2, a crate even more astonishing, Coca-Cola on ice in glass bottles that sweated like living things. Hans's first swallow struck him like a slap from the inside. He coughed and blinked. The farmer's daughter glanced away from the embarrassment, then back with a look Hans recognized from another life. Someone seeing another person oddly human. He almost smiled and didn't. The pay would show up later. Far from this field, about 80 cents credited to a ledger under his number, convertible only to canteen purchases, cigarettes, stationery, a bar of soap that smelled faintly of something green. The farmer would settle his own ledger with the army. There would be, between them, an ocean of paperwork. In the middle of that ocean, a man would stand at a counter and choose whether to buy a pencil. Adjust, work, ledger, back to the wire. Hans's English crawled forward, the way a careful man crosses ice, one step, test, another step. He kept it utilitarian, thank you, that one. Slower, please, tool names, numbers. How long? He didn't reach for phrases he couldn't hold. When he fumbled, Doherty answered without enjoying the fumble, and something unknotted in Hans's shoulders. He had been taught that mockery was power. Mercy turned out to be a better mechanic, once, at dusk. After tools had been signed in, and the truck was late, the men waited near the motor pool, where the day's dust gathered in ankles and settled out like evening fog. Doherty leaned back on a crate, harmonica turned in his hands, and said to no one, "My old man fixed tractors. Fixed me once or twice, too." The admission landed softly and stayed. Hans looked at his hands. They had learned a few things you can't teach with orders. How tight is too tight, how much to force before you stop. How to listen to a machine's mood. If there was a dangerous feeling hiding in those hours, it was relief mutating into trust. Hans fought it by keeping the ledger in mind. Credits, purchases, routine, because that ledger was honest in a way feelings can fail to be. He had seen how men could turn on a thought. Paper rarely turns if kept dry and away from flame. So he wrote down tool numbers, shift start times, the phrase choke half in small neat letters. He wrote down names, Doherty, Johnson, Mrs. Johnson. The girl with the crate. He did not write friend. He wrote works right. That night in the barracks, Ernst, the mechanic with the river scar, grinned and said, "The guard likes your ear. He likes the carburetor," Hans answered. It was the safest truth. Ernst's grin softened. Same thing. In the language Hans was learning, some words pull more than their weight. Neighbor is one of them. He didn't use it, but out in the field, when a man handed him a wrench without being asked, when he caught the end of a beam without being told, when the guard flicked his eyes once and Hans stepped back one pace because rules are kept by timing as much as by threat. Something neighborly happened and then passed, leaving both men with their dignity unspent. One evening, as the truck rolled, the horizon lit with heat lightning, silent, theatrical, all show. They watched without comment. Doherty said finally, "Storms too far east to matter." He wasn't talking about the weather. Hans nodded. He didn't ask which storm. The rule held, say only what the work requires. Save the rest for the wheat, which learns everything eventually and never gossips. Kindness was not the only weather. Inside the wire another climate held, a microclimate organized by fear. It moved between bunks and along the latrine tile, wrapping itself in whispers and glances that measured men, who took classes, who sat near the guards on movie night, who lingered over the camp newspaper's cartoons, a beat too long. They had a name in mutters, diehards, though no one said it with pride loud enough to earn consequences. They pressed collars as if inspections were still a way to matter. They clicked heels in private, a noise like flint, and they policed opinion with a vigilance that could not accept the possibility that a man might have seen something in Kansas he had not been meant to see. The first sign arrived small. A letter returned to Hans with a new rip at the edge that wasn't the censor's neat stamp, but a fingernail's impatience. He checked his words. He had written of work, of food, of offence that held both men and worry at arm's length. He had not praised anyone. He rewrote the letter, flattened it with his palm, and sent it again. The second sign came fast on the first. The pillow seam in his bunk picked out with a blade. Cotton like snow on a floor that did not deserve weather. The worst came one evening in the washroom, when steam hung heavy enough to make the lights into yellow moons. Hans heard a scuffle find shape in the far stall. A thud, a pleaded whisper cut short, the dry slap of someone hitting tile. The men who emerged held their faces in straight lines, which is how you hide the shape of your teeth. On the floor remained a sketchbook, open to a pencil study of a guard's profile, done with tenderness that was not approval, but could be misread as such by men who had decided tenderness was treason. The guard's jaw and the way his cap shadowed his eye, there was no unseeing it. Men who live by slogans, hate clear seeing because it refuses to shorten the world. They never said the artist's name. They didn't need to. He arrived at breakfast a week later, with a bruise mapped like a country no one wanted to visit. The guards noticed. The lieutenant walked the rows of tables with a notebook open and no pen moving. He saw and did not write. There are acts you can only execute once you have watched long enough to know who does what to whom and why. For a few weeks, the atmosphere thinned, no open damage, just the abrasion of small threats. A book went missing from a bunk. A pair of work gloves ended up soaked and useless. Men who used English words out loud at night found themselves waking to silence from neighbors who had been talkative yesterday. The diehard's method was to make interaction dangerous, to starve curiosity by associating it with pain. It nearly worked. Hans adjusted. He practiced English in his head, and in a notebook he kept beneath the mattress, rather than in air. He still signed out pencils at the library, but stopped drawing in the yard. He nodded less and looked down more. This was not cowardice. It was the tactical patience of a man who knows that some rules require time to hold. He wasn't alone. Ernst started helping the English teacher clean up after class, which gave them 5 minutes to talk about verbs while stacking chairs, the most innocent-sounding act in any language. A quiet former schoolteacher named Friedrich produced a copy of a German novel with the Nazified passages cut out and passed it along with the casual grace of a man who has removed a splinter from a finger and offers the tweezers to the next in line. In the yard, men began to stand in pairs that didn't draw attention, back to back in a way that let each see what the other couldn't. The guards saw more than they said. You can tell when a man is learning in spite of discouragement. He carries his shoulders as if the air itself is a serious subject. Doherty didn't comment. He placed the tool chest nearer Hans on field days and watched the barracks door a second longer at evening. The lieutenant began to shuffle bunks with the plausible excuse of sanitation rotation, which turned out to be a method for breaking up clusters without naming them. The camp command started sending reports up the chain that read like weather bulletins: localized turbulence, minor property damage, probability of escalation without intervention. Then, in early autumn, the word transfer acquired new gravity. Trucks rolled up before breakfast, not the farm detail flatbeds, but closed transports with numbers on their flanks and a silence to their idling that said paperwork had preceded them. Names were read. No one called them diehards. The officer used phrases like segregated facilities and administrative decision. The men who boarded did so with stiff dignity or with the edgy bravado of people who prefer rage to fear. One turned to spit and thought better of it. The truck doors swung shut with a finality that felt less like punishment and more like a settling. The yard that afternoon sounded different. Wind made itself heard again, where voices had crowded. On the soccer field, a ball moved from foot to foot without traveling so quickly to the sideline's watchful stares. In the library, the librarian stamped a book, and without lifting her eyes, slid a second pencil across the desk. No words, just a smooth motion that might have been coincidence. It wasn't. Hans walked to the fence and looked out at the same Kansas as yesterday. The difference was behind him. Breathing room is not the same as freedom, but it shares a wall with it. He took out his notebook and wrote in English for the first time in days, the letters clumsy and earnest. We keep rules today. It helps. He underlined helps once. He had learned from the field, over-tighten a bolt and you break the stud. Overstate a sentence and you break its truth. The men who remained did not suddenly become friends. They became people who could risk thought without bruises. That risk is where everything else begins. The morning after the transfers, the camp sounded like it had been swept. Not emptied, no one pretended, but cleared of a grit that had made every conversation grind. Men who had been holding themselves like fists, unclenched half a knuckle. You cannot build a library with fear. You can stack shelves, but you cannot persuade a mind to pick a book when it expects a blow for noticing a sentence. Now, with the hardliners gone to other camps, the ordinary business of being human resumed in quiet, administrative ways. The lieutenant called it rebalancing, a word that belonged on a scale in a mill, not in a yard. It fit anyway. Bunks were reassigned again, this time with no pretense of sanitation. The orchestra auditioned 2 new violinists who had kept their cases closed for months. The English class doubled, then split into beginners and stubborn beginners, which made men laugh at themselves in a way that didn't cost anyone's skin. At the canteen, Hans bought a pencil without looking over his shoulder first. The clerk, a prisoner with neat hair and a habit of counting change twice, even though it was scrip, said, "You draw," in German. It wasn't a question. Hans nodded. The clerk slid a gum eraser across the counter as if it had fallen there by accident. It had not. Out on the Johnson farm, the tone shifted by degrees. Mrs. Johnson spoke 2 more sentences than yesterday, both about weather, which in this state is politics you can agree on. The farmer left a tin of salve on the crate near the water without comment. It found its way to cracked hands and back to the crate by communal logic. Doherty loosened the leash an inch. The prisoners worked a row beyond the truck's shadow line while he watched from the end instead of the center. The trust wasn't sentimental. It was useful. Breathing room made other things grow. Hans found himself reading at speed he hadn't managed since school, stumbling less, backing up less often to rehammer a grammar nail that wouldn't sit. The English teacher began an experiment called Conversation Corner, 5 minutes at the end, where men tried small talk in a language built for small talk. It produced phrases that would not win awards. Good bread, hot day, I like that song, tomorrow field. They felt like ladders, each rung close enough to the next to risk lifting a foot. One late afternoon, the orchestra's rehearsal bled through the yard like color. A clarinet tried a scale. A cello landed a note that vibrated wooden walls in sympathy. Hans stood in the doorway and watched men put a piece of Europe into an American room with borrowed instruments and time the army could have denied, but didn't. He imagined his mother's hands rolling dough to a radio that had been dangerous to tune. He let the image pass before it stopped him. The work kept everyone honest. The harvest was not done. Fences did not repair themselves because men had become easier to speak around. Johnson handed Hans a task list written in pencil on a page torn from a calendar. East Gate, Trough Leak, South Fence Corner. He had adopted the useful habit of writing "done" in block letters, where finished work lived. That word did a man good. Doherty's harmonica came out more evenings now, 2 or 3 notes only, because too much music in a place like that feels like cheating. Hans answered sometimes with a whistle through his teeth that found the same interval without growing flesh. They did not talk about it. Music in that place was like smuggling. You did it with the lights turned down and no one said where it came from. With breathing room came another hazard, nostalgia that lied. Men began to speak of home in sentences glossed with syrup, ham that had never been that thick, streets that had never been that clean. Hans felt the pull and set an anchor in paper. He wrote in German that Hamburg was rubble and hunger and numbers written on doors. He wrote in English that Kansas had rules that worked and fences that held without insult. He needed both truths together to remain upright. One evening, a cloud bank moved in from the west like a corrugated wall. The wind changed smell from dust to electric. Doherty watched the sky and said, "Storm by midnight." He was right. Rain hit the roof with a sincerity Kansas does not fake, and men reached their arms out of bunks to feel it stream along the sill. Somewhere in the barracks, someone began the Our Father in German. Someone else whispered Amen in English. No one argued about either. The storm had the floor. After lights out, Hans took his sketchbook and tried hands, Doherty's, Mrs. Johnson's, his own. He couldn't get the tendon right across the thumb. He erased, redrew, cursed in a whisper, and finally left the line imperfect. It occurred to him that imperfection was the signature of breathing room. Perfection is a closed room. Nothing alive lasts long in it. He wrote that down to see if the thought would live the night. Rules give room. Room gives mistakes. Mistakes teach. In those weeks, the camp changed shape without changing layout. Men stood taller without rising. The guards spoke less sharply without losing authority. Work moved faster because men had put down a weight you cannot see on a scale. It was not freedom, but it was the space in which a mind can turn around without bumping its shoulders on someone else's rage. News travels at 2 speeds, the speed of paper and the speed of rumor. In March 1945, paper won a grim race. A letter from Hamburg arrived with brittle folds and a damp corner, like it had crossed a climate too sad for envelopes. Hans recognized his sister's narrow hand. The lines ran short, like the breath of someone who had been carrying buckets upstairs all morning. House gone. "We are in Aunt Lotta's 2 rooms, Mama." The sentence ended oddly, as if a hand had taken it away for a moment and returned it with a piece missing. A censor's mark rode the edge. The word alive did not appear. The word dead did not either. Hans read the letter, sitting on his bunk with his boots still on, because he could not bear the humility of removing them for news like this. He folded the page, unfolded it, then folded it another way to create a form that might hold better. It did not. That night he wrote a reply in short sentences a censor could let stand. "I have enough to eat," he wrote. He crossed it out, wrote "I am okay," crossed that out, then wrote "I am healthy. Tell me if you are." He set the pencil down and let his hand lose its tremor before he added, "I work. The rules here help." The page bore the history of the struggle, 3 ghost lines beneath the line that remained, the past arguing with the present and losing politely. Around them, the war tipped. In April, the guards assembled the yard mid-morning. The lieutenant removed his cap and said, officially and plainly, "President Roosevelt has died." The sentence lifted its own weight. And then there was the silence that follows a statement not up for debate. Even the wind understood. Caps came off without orders. A man near Hans crossed himself. Another stared at the ground, like he had stepped where he shouldn't. Hans felt no allegiance to the man, but loss is a language you can hear in any uniform. He stepped back to make space for it to speak. On a projector screen in the mess hall that night, newsreel frames jumped. Ships, crowds, a motorcade, a face Americans had been looking at for years. The narration crackled with the formal grief of a country that knows how to word things. The guard at the door kept his eyes low and counted people coming in and out like he was measuring a ritual. Someone coughed in the quiet, then apologized to no one.